happy to host today Professor George Yancy. It's a great honor to have him today. George Yancy is the Samuel Candler-Dobbs Professor of Philosophy at Emory University and the Montgomery Fellow at Dartmouth College, one of the college's highest honors. He's also the University of Pennsylvania's inaugural fellow in the Provost Distinguished Faculty Fellowship Program. Yancy is the author, editor, and co-editor of over 20 books. He's cited at Academic Influence as one of the top 10 influential philosophers in the last 10 years, based upon the numbers of citation and web presence. He also has published over 200 combined scholarly articles, chapters, and interviews that have appeared in professional journals, books, at various news sites. He is well known for his influential essays and interviews at New York Times with a philosophy column titled The Stone, and at the prominent political website The Truth Out. Yancy's areas of focus are critical whiteness studies, critical philosophy of race, critical phenomenology, and philosophy of the Black experience. He also is also the editor of the book series Philosophy of Race at Lexington Books. So it's absolutely my pleasure to have you here today, George. Tell us, we can start from here. Tell us what makes you happy about philosophy, if there's
sure.
anything.
Sure. So to answer that question, I have to go back to when I discovered philosophy.
Yeah.
So I wanted to be a pilot when I was a teenager.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And I would often look in. My mother had bought us what were called these world encyclopedias, and there were the blue set. And I would often look at pilots, airplanes, and I would look under P in the encyclopedia. And so one day, serendipitously, I came across the term philosophy as I was looking in the encyclopedia that began with P. And I thought, philosophia, it said, love of wisdom. I thought, what on earth is this? The love of wisdom? And so I read the entire entry and I thought to myself, is this something that I can actually study? And so I remember going to school that very next day, it was still in high school, and I asked a teacher of mine, is this something you can actually get a degree in? And she said, yes, you can get a degree. And I thought, you've got to be kidding me. I can love wisdom, as a job, as doing a job. She says, yes. So I was sort of bitten, or I sort of bit the apple, I guess, of philosophy at that point. And what was interesting is that when I read that entry in the encyclopedia, it resonated with various ways in which I found myself thinking about issues at a very young age. And I can give you two very poignant examples. I remember when I was very young, my mother brought me up as a Baptist Christian. And at night, she would have me and my sister say our prayer. So there was this prayer that you say when you're sitting next to your mother. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep that prayer. And then you say, God bless my mother, my friends, et cetera, et cetera. So one day I asked my mom, I said, and I must have been about 10 years old. I asked my mom, was it okay to pray for the devil? She was completely thrown by this, which is, predictable. And it must have taken her a month or so on to think about this. And eventually she said, yes. So there I was, as a 10-year-old on my knees. At the end of the prayer, I would say, God bless my mother, my sister, and God bless the devil. And what's interesting retrospectively is that this, for me at this very young age, was a serious, I didn't know it, but a serious theological issue, because I was being taught on the one hand in church that we ought to pray for those who need redemption. And the devil was being depicted as this entity that was beyond redemption. So I figured this, prayer from this little black kid, living in the inner city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, might be able to help the devil. So that was one instance. And then there was another where I said to my mother once, again, I'm very young, I said, and I was angry, and I said, why did you give birth to me? I wish you had
Wow.
not given birth to me. And what motivated that point, or that form of protest, is that I knew things died. I mean, we had like, goldfish, they would die. But I didn't know at some point that I would die. It
Mm.
just had not occurred to me.
Mm.
And with this incredible force, it occurred to me one day that I will not be, and my mother will not be. And so I said to her, why did you bring me into this world
Mhm.
such that I have to leave it?
Mm.
Which means, a complete rupture in my continuity, a complete rupture in our relationship, the loving of my sister, the loving of my mother. And I was really angry. I can't remember what her what her response was.
Poor
But it
mother.
was like, right, right. But she accepted it, and but I remember that being sort of a sense of realization of my finitude at that early age. But it was as if I had signed onto a contract that
Mm.
was, a mistake, a deep existential mistake. And so, in reading the encyclopedic entry,
Ah.
it fed it for me spoke to all of these, while implicit, not fully articulated sensibilities around questions of life, death, evil, God. It resonated with those things, and I thought, yes. So in a way, I like to think that philosophy, I didn't just find philosophy, but there's a way in which philosophy found me,
Mm. Seems so. I
right?
mean, you
And
became the pilot of ideas, the pilot, right? Another
absolutely,
kind.
no, that's very good. In fact, I've often
Yeah.
said, philosophy kind of soars. So airplanes kind of soar, they fly high. So there's a kind of an
Yeah,
analogy there, right? A resonance there. Um,
absolutely.
yeah. So that's the thing I think that is at the core, that continues to function as the core of what propels me, the core that feeds the passion of my philosophical sensibilities.
One thing you wrote that resonated a lot with my discovery of philosophy and goes on the opposite side is the sense of nausea, is the sense of dizziness that philosophy can give. I remember when I started doing philosophy, it was overwhelming. Then I discovered Sartre, and maybe it became even more overwhelming, but at least I gave a name to it. Uh, can you tell me more about your experience with those feelings when you encountered philosophy for the first time?
Yeah, sure. Again, I have these wonderful experiences that I can point to. I recall once, again, maybe I was about 17 years old,
Mm.
um, that it occurred to me, and while this is a very strange thing to say, I think Wittgenstein
Ah.
seems to have understood this kind of thing where you're trying to articulate or put into words what it means to be.
Mhm.
And you can't quite represent that thing. It seems to be so elusive. And so one day I'm lying in my bed, and it occurs to me, that I am, that I exist.
Uh,
And right, and it was such a vivacious moment that came with this sense of, I like the way you put it, dizziness,
uh-huh.
a certain kind of perplexity and aporia, um, but definitely dizziness in the sense in which one is thrown off, one becomes disoriented
Mhm.
to one's life, right? Because there's a way in which we are just in the world doing all the things that we do. So this is kind of Heideggerian in a way.
Absolutely.
We're eating, we're going to school, we're drinking out of cups, we're taking showers, we're doing all those things that are
Right.
socially significant. And then all of a sudden, beyond that, beyond, as it were, das Man or the they or the quotidian, there is this emergence that one is. And it was something about the pregnancy of that feeling, that notion, that was so disorienting,
Uh,
so perplexing, that my body actually registered a certain kind of, I refer to it in a fancy way as a tremulous trepidation. like,
It's
like I'm really here.
expression. Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, you know, philosophy has always been, or at least as I've come to mature, a very embodied phenomenon. Philosophy for me is not an abstract Cartesian project that takes us into this otherworldly realm. And even if we speculate in that direction, it begins ab initio from the very beginning as something fundamentally embodied. And so that feeling continues to exist for me, that sense of perplexity, that sense of disorientation. And I think that that's what philosophy ought to do. It ought to throw us into a state of disarray, such that we begin to question the calcified assumptions, presuppositions, ideas that we think are absolute truth, or you know, and what we find is that once that so-called bedrock is shaken, there's ways in which often it can lead to nihilism, or it can lead to something else, right? Or kind of deep skepticism. For me, it led to a kind of generative process. So out of that shaking, for me, it generated this kind of disposition to further interrogate other assumptions that I had taken for granted about my life, about existence, about the existence of God, you know, the meaning of love, you name it, right?
Right.
So there's this flood of dizziness, which we don't think to be dizzy suggests that we are somehow not coherent, but philosophy creates that incoherence, which has its own generativity, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, it keeps you alive. It's
yes.
That amount of oxygen that comes at you at once.
That's right. That's right. And, you know, Nietzsche, I'm pretty sure, had this idea of philosophy not being mummified, right? So, and so I find that oftentimes I'm not interested in reproducing what has existed already. I'm looking for that new thing, that lacuna that has not been filled, so that philosophy constantly shows its human face. Its human face, which is often a face of deep suffering. And so for me, this is why, you know, philosophy is, as a site of passion, etymologically is also a site of deep suffering, because it takes on these issues that are so meaningful for me and so meaningful for all of us collectively.
Let's talk a little about, I mean, the main topics, the main themes of your research. I mean, you are a groundbreaker philosopher. You discussed in a critical way whiteness, race, the condition of classes left behind. Can you give us a sense of how you put together philosophy and these themes? Where does this research lead you to? How does it work still today?
Yeah, I agree with you. I edited a book years ago called The Philosophical Eye, Personal Reflections on Philosophy. And in that book, my contention was that we are homo narrans and what I call, well, I didn't coin these terms, homo narrans and homo significans. We, in some sense, create who we are through the narratives that we tell, and we also signify our identities in terms of who we are through language. So we're all born into a language. There's a passive aspect of the homo narrans. We're all born into stories, rather, and we're also all born into narratives as well as homo significans. But there is the active part where we tell our own stories and where we begin to signify for ourselves. For example, if you think about the Black theorist Malcolm X, when he was born as Malcolm Little, but then he became Malcolm X when he joined the Nation of Islam, and eventually he completely changed his name to El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. So there's a way in which he was born into a world in which he inherited this white man's name, you know, Malcolm Little, and then he began to signify his own name, which implies a certain kind of agency. So for me, when I entered philosophy, I was very much interested in Plato. Plato was the central figure for me. And I remember when I was about 18 years old, I would go around looking in the streets for the Platonic form of a tree. I mean, it sounds
Really?
so funny, yes, because you have to remember I'm reading Plato on my own, so I'm not getting a lot.
Right.
But I know that he is saying something about these forms that exist outside of space and time. And there's a moment where I actually fell in love with trees because I was looking for the form of the tree, and I didn't seem to be successful at finding it. And so I knew that when I went as an undergrad doing philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, it would probably be in the area of epistemology, something like that, and metaphysics. And then I moved from Pitt by the time I got to Yale University, I became interested in questions of hermeneutics and interpretation, which led me to questions of not just hermeneutics in terms of texts, but hermeneutics as a broader framework in terms of thinking about how interpretation and rhetoric functions in the area of science, and how it is that the claims that we make, for an example, that atoms exist or that subatomic particles exist, how do we know there's a direct correspondence between our language and that reality? Sort of the problem that Richard Rorty was challenging, as opposed to that hermeneutic, that framework, or that paradigm, as Thomas S. Kuhn put it, how it shapes the world that emerges. So by the time I got to Yale, I was very much interested in historicity and concretion and the idea of particularity and the way in which each of us are situated. Each is situated within a historical context and how that context shapes our knowledge claims. So by the time I'm ending Yale, I'm thinking, who am I as a historical being? How is it that race and gender affect my identity and my life chances? How does race shape the epistemology that I hold? How does, in the case of white people, how does that shape their epistemology and their paradigmatic understanding of the world? So it was that kind of trajectory that got me to these issues involving questions of race and identity.
That's beautiful.
And in relationship to my own identity, what I came to discover is that there was an entire field called African American philosophy. Yeah. I mean, I had no idea. And partly what students have to understand is that we're still very small. The last I checked, African Americans make up about 1.1% of the profession of philosophy.
Yeah.
And there might be at least 40, maybe less, African American women who have PhDs in the field of philosophy. So philosophy is fundamentally a white male profession. It may very well be the whitest of the humanities. Right. And when we find that to be the case, my very presence in the field becomes noticeable, not only because of the monochromatic whiteness of the field, but also because of what our dear friend, the late Charles Mills, said, the cognitive and intellectual whiteness of the field, where some of the ideas don't resonate with me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this got me sort of thinking very seriously. Charles Mills, for an example, he makes this point in an article he calls, entitles Non-Cartesian Summs, or non-Cartesian summs. And he says, look, Descartes wants us to take him seriously when he says that we don't exist. You know, right there in the first meditation, he's employing hyperbolic doubt, and he's doubting whether he exists. He's doubting whether the table exists, whether you and I are having this conversation. And then he eventually, doubts his body. And then Charles Mills says, let's take that as a paradigmatic form of doing philosophy. And imagine having Black students or students of color in your classroom and have them bear witness to all the news that's going on, let's say about the death of Trayvon Martin or Breonna Taylor or George Floyd. And then as you're teaching that, asking them to take seriously Descartes' assumption that all of us can easily assume that we don't exist. He says, then a deep aporia sets in. Then you begin to think, wait a minute, is this, not only is Descartes not relevant to my life, but is Western philosophy more broadly relevant to my life, right? Because he brings in Ralph Ellison. Ralph Ellison wrote this incredible book called Invisible Man.
Yep.
And the problem with the invisible man is that he is not seen. He is rendered invisible because white people refuse to see him.
Yeah.
And you can imagine the existential alienation that that creates. And Mills contrasts Ellison with Descartes. And if there's a way in which Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man doesn't have to hypothetically assume that he doesn't exist. There's a way in which he does not really exist in a world of white hegemony and white power.
Yeah.
So I think that coming from that embodied place of being racialized as Black and trying to grapple with the question of anti-Black racism, and at the same time trying to make philosophy relevant, trying to make it speak to my identity as a Black male and the kinds of predicaments that I have become very salient. So there's a way in which it's not easy for Black students or students of color, or even women for that matter, to very easily assume the epistemic position of a Cartesian because of all the things they're experiencing. If you remember, Elizabeth of Bohemia is often referred to as a proto-feminist because when she was in conversation with Descartes, she said to Descartes, look, I don't think that I can carry out your project, right? And it's not because she wasn't cognitive, she didn't have the cognitive wherewithal. She was saying there's something about my station in life such that I can't utilize the privacy that your project requires, right? So there's a way in which doing that kind of philosophy can be seen, as Charles Mills would remind us, as a perk of white male privilege. And so I'm interested in, when I teach courses, I'm interested in constantly reminding my students that we live in a real world in which philosophy, some forms of philosophy, can obfuscate those realities. So this is why I think I always remind my students, I have them look at each other and I say, stare at each other for a few minutes because they're often looking at me, looking forward.
Right.
Then I say, close your eyes and imagine that 100 years from now, none of us will be alive. And then I remind them that Cornel West says that we will one day become the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. And it's at this moment that there is a hush that goes across the room. It's like students are quiet. Some might you can see a nervous smile on their faces. But all of a sudden, there's this way in which all of us in that classroom begin to inhabit a very common sense of our finitude. And then the weight of what it means to be, and the weight of what it means someday not to be, perhaps forever. We may never be, we don't know. And the gravity of that moment ushers in, and it radically changes their perception of what it means to be in that classroom and what it means to study philosophy. Yeah, and this is why I think that the relationship between the weightiness of death and the weightiness of race become very important. They begin to understand that, wait, when I'm in this class and I'm white, that's fundamentally different from the way in which if someone is Black or person of color in this classroom. So we try to tease out what that means in terms of what it means to be part of a system that supports you, that gives you an advantage that doesn't give other students. So we talk about what it means, for an example, for a Black person to be pulled over by a police officer, and how when they get pulled over, they say things like, oh, here we go again, because they understand what this means. Whereas when my white students are pulled over, they have the privilege of thinking about other options as to why they're being pulled over. For an example, they might say to themselves, did I fail to signal? Did I run a red light? Is my registration date up to speed or something of the sort? My registration card. But notice what they're doing. They're looking around for instances that are non-racial. So there's this incredible privilege that they have, the privilege of a certain kind of conceptual latitude to think about, or an imaginary that allows them to think about other possibilities other than seeing themselves as raced, because whiteness is a site that is unnamed and it's considered non-raced, because whiteness is what I call the transcendental norm. It defines other groups as racialized or as different or deviant, but it itself is the standard against which those differences are constituted.
Yeah, it seems that with this exercise, you're basically helping them to deconstruct a white metaphysics and to build a new metaphysics that can have multiple possibilities, because Descartes proposes us transcendental presuppositions that are typically white, while if you look at each other for a moment and you seep into, you know, what you see, then you can you can see different conditions of possibilities of reality. It's an amazing.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, in fact, I like the way you put that. There's a way in which Descartes' metaphysics of the self, because we're all, we're all mental substance, right? And for Descartes, there's a way in which when he's in the meditations talking to his interlocutor, when we're reading the text, he's supposing a universal, neutral epistemic subject. Right? And so race or gender or sexual orientation or ability, all of these things are irrelevant to Descartes. For Descartes.
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which I think you're right. The idea is to deconstruct a certain kind of metaphysics of whiteness that is able to, I don't want to say allow for, but what you're doing is deconstructing and doing a kind of genealogy where you pull back the veil, the illusion of whiteness as universal, and reveal it as another particularity.
Exactly. Because I think we have that embedded. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Which of course then radicalizes the classroom in a very different way. Then we're forced to come to terms with the concretization of ideas. We're forced to come to terms with history, standpoint epistemology. We're forced to come to terms with the way in which each one of us belong to groups in ways that we often think that we don't, because we often think of ourselves as neoliberal subjects, sort of atoms, we're atomized, but that's not true. We're part of these aggregates, and we have to think about the ways in which those aggregates impact not just how we comport ourselves in the world, but also how we think about the world, how we conceptualize the world, how we imagine what is possible and what isn't possible, how we are ethical or unethical toward the world. So it kind of goes all the way down. If you will, for me, the self is fundamentally historical all the way down. And so in really going back to your question about dizziness, there's a way in which my white students become incredibly dizzy.
Yeah.
And they do this through the term that I love is parrhesia, Parrhesia. And parrhesia is the Greek term that means courageous speech or fearless speech. And Foucault talks about that term as a term that perhaps has one walking on the edge of death, because one dares to speak up against those hegemonic structures that can easily cause one's death. But with parrhesia or courageous speech, there also has to be courageous listening. And with courageous listening, there's vulnerability. So what I'm trying to do in my classrooms then, for me, philosophy is about vulnerability, right? Vulnerability, being vulnerable doesn't have much in the political discourse, right? But vulnerability is incredible way of being receptive, being open. Another phrase that I often use is being unsutured, of a way that we open ourselves to modes of feeling, modes of pain, modes of being different that really strike us and ought to make us disoriented. So that when my students leave my classrooms, oftentimes they leave in silence. It's when they leave in silence that I know that something has happened in that classroom.
Yeah.
That's right. And sometimes they'll say, did he really say that? When they say that, particularly after I say that we're all going to die, it's like, did he really say that? This morning at 10 a.m.? Yes, I did say it. Welcome to the club of being completely dizzy and falling in love with philosophy. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I wish I was in one of your classes now to learn. Look, coming back to the beginning of your answer, I'm curious if you understood, you discovered what kind of tree you are. You were talking about reading Plato and looking around for these trees and looking for the idea of the tree, but in fact you found the manifestation of the trees, the reality of the trees. What kind of narrative, what kind of significance did you give to yourself, to your life? Did you discover, what type of tree?
Oh, that's interesting. Wow, that's a really good question, and you're forcing me to, in a good way, to think retrospectively about this. So I would say that in my effort to discover that tree that is timeless, that does not have any spatial temporal relation to the empirical world, there's a way in which the tree that I discovered was the tree that is has a materiality. It gives itself over to touch. It gives itself over to a certain fragrance. And while I didn't taste the tree, it would give itself over to a certain taste as well. But there's a way in which the tree that I discovered, and also the framework that it opened up then, is the fleshiness of life, as opposed to this, we'll call it disembodied abstract thing called a form. And as a result, then, it suggests a certain kind of my preoccupation then with embodied relationality, right? Rather than being so preoccupied with the vertical, I became interested in the horizontal, the historical, the quotidian, the very thing that it seemed like philosophy was saying, no, don't go in that direction. And as such, allowing me to appreciate the way in which all of us are connected, the way in which all of us are linked, and the way in which all of us ought to be, in Judith Butler's words, grievable, the ways in which all of us suffer, the ways in which all of us are in pain and are wounded on a daily basis. And while I haven't completely given up the vertical, because I think for me, the vertical and the horizontal work together in a kind of cruciform way, I think that rather than being so preoccupied with the vertical, I think that the work to be done is on the horizontal. The idea is to put this in ecological terms, what matters is not the metaphysical tree. What matters is the embodied tree that will help sustain us during climate crisis. Right?
Yeah.
if you link it that way, I'm so glad that you put it that way. That's a really wonderful way of forcing me to think this. There's a way in which the horizontal brings us back to the necessity to live lives and to live lives of deep meaning, so that we understand the way in which we are sutured to others and the ways in which we're implicated in the lives of others, It's what I call an ontology of no edges. The fact that there isn't an edge, an outermost limit. We're always already linked and contiguous with others. Absolutely. And I think in that reality, that suggests an incredible level of responsibility, not only just my responsibility to you and you to me and me to the audience and the audience to me, but also the world, nature. I mean, COVID has, if it's taught us anything, it's taught us the ways in which we are not neoliberal, we are not atomic, but we are fundamentally intricately linked, right? Such that when we do something that we think we're doing in isolation, it creates ripples, right? In fact, it can destroy an entire ecosystem. So I think that, that's really good. The kind of tree then that becomes important to me is the tree that has roots, the tree that is grounded in the earth in such a way that it's interconnected, and in such a way that what we really want to do is undergird those roots with nourishment. We want to undergird them with the kind of knowledge, the kind of wisdom that will help us all grow in a much more radical way, not just growing in the sense that we grow within an already existing system or structure, but as Judith Butler says, where there's an insurrection at the level of ontology itself, right? So that when we're talking about inclusion, and Wendy Brown talks about this, inclusion, according to a kind of liberal multiculturalism, inclusion just says, hey, look, we're here, notice us. Or where the power structure says, you see, you're here, but being here does not constitute radicality, because just putting different faces and different bodies in certain places doesn't itself shift ipso facto the system itself, right? So rather than that liberal multiculturalism, which can actually reproduce, even if one is unaware, reproduce the very structures that required the inclusion in the first place. I think that what we need to do then is to undo those structures, to undo the very paradigmatic way in which we think about what constitutes the human, the paradigmatic way in which we think about our relationship to the earth, which is also an other, right? And we have to come to terms, and we have to ask ourselves, how does that other speak to us in its own language, not in our language, right? So yeah, that tree point brought me. Thank you for that. Your tree point has brought me to the appreciation of mundanity and the appreciation of the everyday, the face-to-face relations and the responsibility that we have to the other. That is mutual and interdependent.
Absolutely. And it is curious to see how Kant gave us the image of trees as competitors with each other, right? Well, instead, the reality is that the trees are it's a strong intersubjective community. So much so that if you want to replant a forest and so on, you have to understand who is the mother, the chief tree that gives nourishment to the other group, and then move the tree with others. I mean, there's a community, not a competition. Kant.
No, absolutely. And I like that. And the complexity of roots, right? Exactly. The way in which we think about that over a kind of arboric understanding of trees.
Yeah. So the metaphor works also out of the metaphor itself. Look, I know I read that at some point you had I don't know, I suppose, but maybe not. You had to rethink yourself. You had to retrace yourself. I read that at some point you became a dangerous philosopher. That, oh God, that you became part of the philosopher's watch list. what was that?
Yeah,
And
yeah, sure.
yeah.
Sure. So in 2015, I wrote, this is when I was writing for the Stone, and I wrote, I had done a series of interviews actually, which was quite unprecedented at the New York Times on race. So I interview various philosophers who do race, from Anthony Appiah to Naomi Zak and some others. And it was quite incredible. People love tuning in and reading the next interview that I would do. And the late Gary Gutting did a series of interviews on philosophers of religion. And his last piece that he wrote, instead of interviewing someone, he decided to interview himself, which was pretty creative, I thought. But I thought to myself, my end piece, I didn't want to sort of interview myself. I thought that what I wanted to do is bring out whiteness in a more thematized way. I thought to myself, how can I construct a letter that will speak to white people of whiteness in such a way that it wouldn't make them defensive? So I called this letter Dear White America. It was the salutation. It was a letter in which I said it was an act of love. It was a gesture of love. In fact, in the letter, I even said things like, look, I am a sexist. I said that. And I said, there's great risk of me saying this publicly. I am a sexist. And I said, look, I understand that I'm not Bill Cosby or Weinstein or Epstein in that sense. I understand that. But nonetheless, as a self-identified male, I have undergone the inculcation of various ways of perceiving the world, ways of perceiving women. I have embedded within me the male gaze, which I think is fundamentally violent toward women. I have internalized certain affects, certain judgments, certain aesthetic standards, all of which mediate my relationship with women, which can be very dangerous and Procrustean in as much as it delimits the very being of a woman. It's violent toward the being of a woman. So I gave them that, meaning in the paper, I thought, let me show you what vulnerability looks like. Let me publicly say it. I am a, right? So the piece was published. It came out, as I recall, it came out on Christmas morning.
Oh, no.
So it was a sort of a metaphorical and literal gift in a certain way.
Yeah.
And it was at that moment that the emails started.
Immediately.
So immediately.
Wow.
And I mean an influx. The Dear White America just went viral. And I got email messages. I eventually got voice messages at my university. I started to get physical mail sent to me, postcards. So people would write letters, put a stamp on the envelope. And I don't know if I can use the N word on the podcast, but I'll say it, just to call me a nigger in writing, right? I have been called the N word since the publication of that piece more times than I can remember. I have been called names from monkeys to apes to words I can't even begin to share with you right now. Death threats. It got so bad that I needed to have Emory police escort me to my classes. And when I went to give public talks, for me, it would be a requirement that they have police in the back of the auditorium or wherever it was I was lecturing. And of course, again, also my name was put on the professor watch list, which is a conservative website that apparently surveils, places under surveillance, thinkers who are deemed leftist. Now, I've never called myself a left thinker, but I made it on the watch list, which is a very draconian, right? Which is a very draconian, very Orwellian, Orwellian conceptualization. So what I wanted is for a level of honesty. I wanted white people to fracture, to unsuture, to be vulnerable, to be wounded, which that word means etymologically. And while I did get some very fascinating responses that were positive, the majority were horrible, deep, racist, vitriolic nastiness that some of which I couldn't even imagine. There was one that said the person wanted to put a meat hook into my body.
No.
Oh,
what does that mean even?
I have no idea. What one person wrote, and I'm assuming it was a male, he wrote, a white male, he wrote that the reason that Yancy wrote Dear White America is that so he could have more sex with white women.
Oh.
Now, I thought to myself, surely it must be easier to have sex with white women than to write a letter for to the New York Times.
Exactly.
but notice we have to ask ourselves, whose imaginary is this coming from? Whose projections are these, right? So all I was doing is asking white people to think about the way in which, even though they may not see themselves as racist, they are implicated. They are complicit in a system, right? That where there is their skin in the game, such that the distinction between non-racist and racist becomes a little confusing, right? It's not clear. And while it was clear to me, as I made clear, that I'm not saying that you're a part of the Klan or the Proud Boys or the Boogaloo movement, that's obvious. But to be racist, it's not necessary for one to be part of the Klan, right? And that was the message. And I'll put it this way, white America's response was evasion, denial, and violence. That was its response to my letter, Dear White America. And in response to that piece, I decided to write an article called I Am a Dangerous Professor.
Tell us some.
And fascinatingly enough, a lot of junior scholars wrote to me saying, you know, thank you so very much for saying this, because I can't say it because I might lose my job.
That's true.
So it felt good for me to have written this, but also by dangerous professor or dangerous philosopher, what I meant by that is that if teaching your students to question fundamental assumptions about what goodness is and what justice is and what beauty is and what it means to be a beautiful human being or a virtuous soul, if asking my students to think about their own finitude and their own imminent death, to get them to think about the ways in which they are constituted beyond their own agency in ways that they don't want to be constituted. If that's what it means to be a dangerous professor or a dangerous philosopher, then I am in fact a dangerous professor and dangerous philosopher, because that's what I want my students to do. I don't want them to do what Paulo Freire critiqued as the banking system of education, right? You're not just a blank slate that shows up in my classroom, right? You already have a wherewithal of critical ideas and language, but now it's time for us to engage dialogically and see what happens in that space, a sort of higher form of conscientization, where we begin to now think about our world critically, but not just the world, ourselves critically, and to be honest. So I think honesty is so incredible in a classroom. And that's what I want my students to be. I want them to be honest to the point where, honest to a fault, where they are prepared. And of course, but to do this, you have to create a context within which the whole classroom experiences this kind of collective vulnerability. But yet a vulnerability, because vulnerability doesn't make sense if there's nothing to lose. If there's nothing to risk. So my students come to understand that there's something to lose. And often the things that we're talking about are things like sexism, patriarchy, blind and violent forms of capitalism and materialism, militarism, white supremacy, xenophobia. That's what we're trying to lose, right? That's we're trying to understand how that stuff doesn't exist just out there in the world, but how it exists within us. So that for me, then doing philosophy tries to transcend the extramural and intramural distinction. There's a way in which philosophy has to become public, and there's a way in which the public is already in the classroom, that our classroom spaces are not these sacred, hallowed ground, right? It's not that. They're muddy. They're dirty spaces. They're confusing spaces, right there in the classroom, you know? Yeah, so that was the story. That's the story behind I Am a Dangerous Professor.
Well, so yeah, I mean, Socrates that was put to death for much less, maybe. What can you say? It's said. I'm glad that you make your student do this gazing exercise, because I think it's really the answer. I wonder if teaching so little philosophy in the US, and unfortunately now all over the world, because we don't teach much philosophy, lead to these results. Because questioning yourself, your identity is tough. You lose your certainties, and this creates a wave of hatred feelings that are shocking. And it's in fact just a healthy exercise to be clean, to, take a shower, I would say, right? Okay, today I will question this aspect of myself. I will clean this other, just to regenerate yourself, to breathe more. But I understand how for many people this is incredibly scary.
And in the US, it's very scary, particularly when you have right-wing Republicans and just the right more generally, who are, banning certain books, perhaps burning soon, banning books, or trying to get rid of critical race theory and misconstruing its meaning and its origin. I think that in the face of the kind of populism and demagoguery and neo-fascism that we're experiencing within the US, I think philosophy is certainly the enemy of the state. There's no question about it. But you raised the point about Socrates, right? And depending on one's interpretation of Socrates, I read him radically. I think that they wanted to put him to death because he practiced parrhesia.
Really? Yeah.
And I think that being a gadfly and stinging people, and by stinging, making them aware of, having them to see the brutality in front of them. I remember I was reading just a little passage from Susan Sontag, philosopher Susan Sontag, where she was talking about looking at images on the television of brutality and death. And I remember looking at the deaths that were taking place in Ukraine. And she says that, and I felt sympathy for these individuals, but Susan Sontag brings critical attention to the concept of sympathy and says that sympathy itself can imply innocence, which also implies impotence. And how does that work? Well, it sort of says, I'm on the other side of the television, looking at these images that are miles and miles away. And this sympathy that I have suggests that somehow what I am as an American is disarticulated from the violence that's happening in the Ukraine, right? And I like that, right? I like that because it suggests that there's a way in which, when we're sympathetic, or when we're empathetic, or when we show goodwill, we create a distantiation from the ways in which we are implicated or complicit with the pain and suffering precisely of the person that we're having empathy or sympathy for, because we never question, what is my role in that?
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so you're right. So there's a way in which what I want my students to do, if we're going to continue in this fragile experiment known as democracy, it seems like they have to become critical, introspective, dangerous citizens. And by that we mean critiquing the taken for granted, critiquing those apparent self-evident truths that have been broken, right? To critique the words written on parchment in the Constitution. And in doing so, to make the entire nation dizzy, right? But that's what the United States fears. Dizziness is anathema. because it's that sense of, because to be not dizzy means that you are on track, you are oriented. As Sarah Ahmed says, you've already adopted an orientation, but that orientation is leading to the deaths of millions abroad. It's leading to indifference to the poor, to those who suffer from violence, those who are queer, who undergo violence, the George Floyds, the Breonna Taylors, you name it. So what we want to do, it seems to me that philosophy and philosophers have this incredible responsibility to upset the status quo. But quite frankly, I don't see too many philosophers doing this, right? There's a way in which we do philosophy in the classroom, but then when we come out, we just become citizens, right? But no, I think that philosophical spirit, that disruptive way of being a gadfly, that disruptive way of practicing elenchus, critical questioning and cross-examination, has to happen within the public sphere, because philosophy otherwise becomes irrelevant, inconsequential, and just this kind of esoteric thing that we do without any meaning to the real world or to our lives, right? And so often I'm constantly trying to realign who I am with the question of, metaphilosophically, what is it that I'm practicing? I think that has to be a constant tension in philosophers. In scholars, generally, I think we have to continue to critique what it is that we do. If you're a historian, you have to think about what it means to do history at a meta level, and what that implies about the self that you are politically, aesthetically, emotionally, ethically. In that way, you're keeping alive the two rather than balkanizing them in such a way that when you leave the classroom, philosophy's gone.
Yeah, no. There must be the silence, as you were saying.
Yes. Yeah.
In silence. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And that makes, of course, that makes philosophy very monastic, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what Descartes was doing, a very monastic enterprise, where you go into your stove-heated room and you contemplate, right? But at some point you have to come out, it seems to me. And the thing is, what's interesting is Descartes didn't raise this in his meditations, but even if, as he is in his stove-heated room, society is in that stove-heated room with him. It doesn't leave him. It's still there.
Yeah, that's the point. That's absolutely. And that's the naivete of certain white metaphysics. I mean, society remains.
Oh, that's right.
In general.
Oh, absolutely. That's right.
Look, now we are called to write syllabi, to renew our syllabi. It's at least in my university, we are trying to be more inclusive. There's the word diversity that comes up very often. And what do we do? What are we doing? I mean, in the light of what you were saying, what does the word diversity mean for you? How can we make this word actually meaningful and not another miasma, another stain, another?
Yeah, I don't think we're there.
Right.
Which isn't to say, right? I mean, because what we have to realize is, I mean, when you think about racial segregation or Jim Crow in the United States, what you're thinking about, obviously, or not what you think about, but the reality is that Black people were segregated from white people. Why? Well, because you don't want people who are inferior, who smell, who are ape-like around real human beings who are white, right? Clear, that's white ideology. But within that structure, you see, if you look at the history of the movement, the civil rights movement, the idea was to gain more inclusion, to be recognized. So recognition and visibility and inclusion become important to a certain kind of political project. And what I want to say, there's a part of me that says that's what the civil rights movement was all about. It was about inclusion. But at the same time, we have to say, as one Black civil rights theorist put it, you know, we're not protesting just to be able to eat a hamburger or a cheeseburger next to white people. You know, that's not our goal, right? Quite frankly. And I agree. again, going back to Judith Butler's concept of an insurrection at the level of ontology, there's a way in which I think that there has to be a different form of civil rights, Black civil rights movement that has a very different understanding or radical understanding of diversity. Where again, inclusion doesn't reduce to the number of bodies that are in places or in high places. Because the fact of the matter is you can have Black people occupy higher places, but those Black people, it doesn't follow that they will have the requisite critical ideas to challenge the forces that still continue to stand over them. We can put women, self-identified women, in places of power, but what we find is that often capitalist logics and neoliberal logics take over, and they can say, then we get to say, hey, look, George Yancy, he's a professor of philosophy at Emory, and he's Black. Haven't we made it? No, we have not made it. There's a way in which Black academics, we have to critique and wonder whether or not we've just become neoliberal subjects in Black. Neoliberal subjects in Black. And that the idea of inclusion gives the institution, the academic institution, or whatever institution happens to be, once it opens the doors, it gives them the moral authority and a feeling of satisfaction or satiation that, look, we are not racist or we are not sexist. So it seems to me that when they look out and they see the Black faces and they say, look, why are you complaining? You've made it. Right? It's obvious that I'm asking for more than inclusion. So I think, this brings us back to the syllabus that you were talking about. In my the first day that I teach Intro to Philosophy, I immediately say, this is Western philosophy. I name it, I mark it. Particularly when I have a large diversity of students. Say, this is not Asian philosophy, it's not African philosophy, it's not Latinx philosophy, it's not Chicano philosophy, you name it. It's not any of those philosophies. So by doing that, I want my students to understand that we're not learning philosophy qua philosophy. In fact, I'm not even sure if there is something called philosophy qua philosophy, but if there is, it would go by the name of white philosophy because they only do philosophy. After all, reason itself, as the myth goes, grew out of Greece itself, right? Reason was given birth to out of Greece, as fanciful as that is. So
which is not completely white, actually, if you think about it.
That's right. So there's a way in which one tells the story of Western civilization such that one whitewashes the whole history, so that you begin with the ancient Greeks all the way up to the American Empire. Right? Just one long stretch of progress.
Absolutely.
And so, excuse me. So I think that what we need to do really is to pay more attention to that silent surplus that remains after we include. I mean, I've never said it that way, and so I'm glad you asked me. This is the first time I've said anything like that. In fact, I'm going to write it down.
I'm glad.
The silent surplus. That's really good. That remains, and there is a silent surplus. So that when we think about diversity, when we think about how do we organize our syllabi, there's a way in which we do that against the backdrop of what's normal. I remember taking a course when I was in grad school, when I did grad work at Duquesne, and I took a course in a grad course in African American Lit, and I remember saying to the students, I was a student there too. I was the only Black student there that day, and I remember telling the white students, "Look, we were reading Frederick Douglass, and I said I'm really upset by the way in which Douglass was treated, the way in which he was beaten, the way in which he was considered a beast of burden." And I asked the white students, how did they feel about the white slave masters? And, they said, we haven't really thought about that. So while I could identify with Douglass, they could not identify with the white slave masters. There's a way in which they didn't see themselves implicated in the text. And I say that to say, there's a way in which African-American lit became Black literature, where Shakespeare and Chaucer, it's not white literature or European literature. It's literature. Right? But yet, as Black people, we're forced, when we're reading European literature, to identify ourselves with the characters. When we watch television, when we watch movies where it's predominantly white characters, we have to empathize with white characters. It's a hell of a burden to ask white people to watch movies that are all white, and yet to resonate with those themes, and then to watch our own stuff with Black characters and resonate there, but they don't do the same, right? So the amount of labor that's done. And so I'm saying that to say, I think that it's not just about numbers. It's not just quantitative. There has to be a fundamental, radical deracination of the silent surplus so that we don't talk about diversity. If diversity is going to always be linked to hegemony, it seems to me that that's a questionable form of diversity. It seems to me that maybe there will be a time in our future where we don't talk about diversity. We talk about the state of the world as, I don't even want to call it equal, but we talk about the state of the world without its balkanizations, where whiteness is no longer the center that continues to hold. Because as long as whiteness holds, as long as patriarchy holds, as long as heterosexism as a structural force holds, as long as ableism continues to hold, there are ways in which those who are ostracized, those who are marginalized, and those who are interpolated as defective, they will always try to become included within that structure. And I think the logics of inclusion within the structure needs to change. So it is not an inclusion. It's I wish I had a better term. It's the way the world is. That's the best I can come up with, right? Since you're asking me such a challenging question, it's the way the world is.
Yeah, we are, and Foucault saw it quite clearly.
Yes.
We are fixated with categorization, with creating boxes, as if this makes our life easier, and instead it's creating a living hell. It's incredible.
Absolutely. And it seems to me, you're right. There's a way in which we on one hand, need certain kinds of categories to make certain kinds of distinctions, but there's these other categories that are given birth to out of a sense of entitlement and a sense of dominance and domination and being at the apex of human civilization, or being the very quintessence of what is normal. That's when it seems to me that those categories, what they're designed to do is to serve the interest of the powerful.
Yeah.
Right. So before long, you find yourself, as I find myself, constantly having to break the categories, or constantly having to confront the categories, right? Which is so much to ask of ourselves. You as a woman, me as a Black man, why should we have to confront those categories, those presuppositions, those superimpositions, those mythopoetic assumptions that box us in, that truncate our very being? Which means on any given day, you wake up and you want to go into the world, as Frantz Fanon says. He wanted to come lithe into the world and move with effortless grace. And then he meets the white gaze, and all of a sudden, there is the pressure, right? Right. There's the as Sarah Ahmed says, there's the phenomenology of being stopped right there, right? Where now you have to re-question, or you're walking down the street as a white woman or as a woman, and there are the cat calls, right? There's the humiliating stares, right? That us men think just are normal ways of looking at women. I don't think so. Those are habits that we've gotten from a system which is predicated on the hatred of women, on their dehumanization. So I think you're right. We have to deracinate those categories, destroy them, quite frankly, force them to implode. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, it's been wonderful to talk to you, and sorry I kept you longer than I expected, actually.
No, it's been a pleasure.
My God, it was absolutely a delight. I would like to ask you one last question, which is a little bit the theme of this podcast. And it's a huge question, but we'll see how we go. What do you think is the meaning of life? And do you think that this meaning can be somehow connected to happiness, or happiness is something completely different? How do you find meaning in all this?
Yeah, that's the kind of philosopher. That's the kind of question that philosophers love, of course.
Exactly. Yeah. We close.
But of course, I'm in process. But to give you the elevator pitch, as it were, I think that for me, and it's very personal. Put it this way: if God does not exist, by that I mean a being that is all loving, all omnibenevolent, that is somehow sustaining the cosmos itself, sustaining us in our very being. If there is no transcendent God in that sense, then it seems to me that there is no ultimate meaning to why we're here, right? I mean, I was thinking about the size of see how my thinking works. I was thinking about the size of the universe the other day, and it turns out that the diameter of the universe is something like 93 billion light years. 93 billion light years. That's big. And so I think that if God does not exist, then ultimately life is meaningless. And I stress ultimately. So I have to go then with someone like a Camus or Jean-Paul Sartre or Simone de Beauvoir, that the only meaning that there is the meaning that we create. So if God does not exist, I think that the meaning that we bring to life, I should say that, the meaning that will fundamentally sustain us will be one in which, as Martin Luther King would put it, the way in which all of us are part of a network that are fundamentally, as we were saying early, intricately sutured together. So that for me to be happy, it is imperative that you are happy. For you to be happy, it's imperative that I am happy. For Syrians who are fleeing war-torn countries, I cannot be happy until they're happy. Right? I cannot be happy until those individuals who are queer are not murdered in the streets. Right? Until, as counterintuitively as it may sound, those soldiers from Russia who are killing Ukrainians, until they understand what it means to love, or for me to love them, that is requisite, it seems to me, to the kind of happiness that I'm thinking about. Right? So for me, I can't separate out. Happiness for me is not that which is that the accumulation of wealth, is not the accumulation of things. Those things obviously can give security, and security is important to happiness. But extravagant forms of security are not important to happiness, right? And you know, so I'm not saying something very dreamy and fantastic that says that child somewhere on the earth right now who is suffering from who's suffering from starvation and who is on the brink of dying. My views are not so fanciful as to say that somehow that child is loved and that child is experiencing happiness. No, there are fundamental ingredients of that life that are missing. the child can't eat. There's no water. I mean, malnutrition is not the condition for the possibility of happiness. So there are fundamental ingredients there, necessities, sine qua non, are important. But if God does not exist, what matters to me, again, is that my happiness is contingent upon yours. Mm-hmm. That if you're not happy, I'm not happy. If there's injustice anywhere in the world, as Martin Luther King might say, I can't be happy. How can I be when I'm implicated in that life? Mm-hmm. And so the vertical then, going back to the vertical and the horizontal,
right? Vertical
collapses. If there is no transcendent being, then all we've got is the horizontal. Mm-hmm. And that means today, I have to make a difference in your life, in the life of my neighbor. Or for that matter, begin to think about those individuals who are not my neighbors. But the etymology of the term neighbor means to dwell near. And many of us don't want to dwell near. Right? Who wants to dwell near? Yeah, absolutely, right? So it's as long as you've got the conflagration between Jews and Palestinians, or you name your balkanization, as long as there are those conflagrations, how can I be happy? Because I'm carrying the weight of their suffering as well. Now, that doesn't mean that for the majority of my day I go around morbid or moping, right? No, I mean I would collapse, right? But then again, maybe to achieve the world that we need, perhaps we need to collapse. Uh-huh. Perhaps we need to fold under the weight of human suffering, such that love, that, as Baldwin says, removes the masks that we fear we cannot live without, but know we cannot live within. We have to remove our masks, and removing our masks, we become more vulnerable. And it's in that vulnerability, I think, in that reaching across those divides, where I'm most happy, where there is an affective intensity that speaks to a kind of wholeness, right? Now, of course, if God does exist, right, then for me, our meaning is greater than the meaning that we create. Mm-hmm. There is a transcendent meaning, but I don't know if there is such a being. So I have often called myself a Christian hopeful theist, putting emphasis on hopeful. Okay. Because I don't know.
I wanted to ask. Right.
I don't know. And it's that knowing that is part of the beauty, because it requires then, it's not about epistemic certainty, it's about hope. It's about staring in the face of a possible abyss and making that Kierkegaardian leap of faith nonetheless, right? But I don't confuse the vertical with the horizontal. For me to do what I have to do, even if the vertical exists, the fact of the matter is we continue to suffer. Mm-hmm. And while I ask the question about where is God as God as God as absent, God as absconditus. While that question is still very meaningful and very urgent, that question, the answer to that question, or the lack thereof, should not prevent us from doing the horizontal work that we have to do on the ground. So there's a way in which we love as if God does not exist. Right? So I think that for me constitutes a meaningful life, and that for me is linked to the very concept of what it means to be happy.
And that explains also the extreme productivity of your work. I mean, your horizontal way of looking at life seems to give you the push to do and do and do. It's incredible what you managed to produce in such a limited time. So,
well, thank you.
We are absolutely happy to have you as a member of our community, of our society.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be here, and I thank you for doing the work that you're doing, because this stretched me, particularly the silent surplus concept. I'm gonna run with that now.
I'm really, really glad. Thank you for joining this conversation today, for being part of this conversation today and joining this project. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.